Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel meta breakdown video. Recently over in Japan, we have started to see results from the Area Number 1 battle. That's basically like the Japanese Rush Duel regionals. And that means we can start seeing some meta results. We'll start seeing some deck lists, some deck choices and card choices that people have been using in large scale tournaments. Now, each of these events are capped at 64 players, but I don't think any of them actually hit that, but they all are in that kind of ballpark. We're talking upwards of 30, 40, 50 players, which means these results do have a bit of weight behind them. Also, since each of the lists do have side decks, we can assume that each of those events were best of 3, which does again add a bit more validity to the decks winning, because winning a couple of best of 1s is not the same as winning a bunch of best of 3 games back to back to back. So if we go down and look at the first lists on here, we can see that the first list here is a Gaia the Fierce Knight list. So with all of these decks, the deck on the left is going to be the first place deck and the deck on the right is going to be the second place deck. So it's up here, winner, image left, Dark Knight Gaia deck. So it's pretty interesting to see Gaia here because Gaia does get shut down pretty hard by Barrier Statue, and Barrier Statue, as we can actually see is in both of these lists, is very, very prominent. Because of this, we started to see a lot of Gaia players include main deck outs to Barrier Statue, such as the Bluetooth Gaia variant. Interestingly, this deck doesn't seem to really include any of that. I'm not really sure how this deck plans to get around Barrier Statue if it comes up against it, but maybe it's just play the game a little bit slower and try and bust through. One of the interesting things to know about this Gaia list is it's only playing the veteran Curse of Dragon and not the veteran Gaia the Fierce Knight, which means there will be less bricks in the deck, but that does potentially mean it'll be a little less consistent at finding those big fusion plays. As for the Sevens Wonder Fusion deck in second place, again, it looks very, very standard. I would say the only thing that maybe stands out to me is it is playing Tension Max, or Crank to 10, which is interesting in a list like this, especially since we already have the 2 Grace Spear, which is usually all the piercing you'd need. Going down to the next list, we have another Sevens Wonder deck and another Sevens Wonder deck. So 2 Wonder decks, both looking pretty interesting. We've got Negate Attack in this one and the 3 Negator Dragons, which is pretty cool. Both of these decks are on Dark Lurker, which again is becoming more and more popular in these types of decks. And interestingly, the winning deck is using Vorse Raider as its legend monster. No doubt to be used alongside Legend Strike, just a really, really powerful staple at the moment. Going down to the next couple of lists, we can see Cyber Dragons, or just kind of Light Machine. Cyber Dragon is a deck that seems to have fallen off a little bit since the release of Phoenix of the Roaring Flame, but it's good to see that it can still fight with the big boys, and it did seem to take down a Sevens Wonder player in the finals, which is what we like to see. Interestingly, the legend of choice is the Floodgate monster Vanity's Fiend, so maybe that is kind of one of the strategies this deck's trying to use, just to try and floodgate out our opponent. It's also on 3 Legend Strike and the 2 Execute Riding, which is great ways to keep your floodgates online, specifically Barrier Statue. So if we go to the next list that we have available to us, we have, again, another winning deck list, and it's Sevens Wonder Fusion. And what's that in second place? Sevens Wonder Fusion, who would have thought? It's almost like it's the most powerful, bursty deck out there at the moment. Interestingly, the winning deck list is playing 1 copy of Defrost Trooper, which is a card that can let you get back an equip spell from the graveyard, and the obvious target for that would be Grace Spear. So it's an interesting little inclusion, as well as 3 copies of Steel Soldier Gale Vinery to presumably just get that AoE attack boost or weaken the opponent's monsters. So some interesting choices in this deck. And then over in the other deck, we are seeing 3 copies of Lurker, opposed to the 0 from the winning deck list. This is very interesting. And the legend monster of choice here is Archfiend Soldier. Again, just a vanilla legend monster to be used alongside Legend Strike to get a pop on the back row. But going down to the next list, we can see Sevens Wonder Fusion Turbo. Who would have thought this deck would keep showing up? Again, there's not a ton to talk about here with this list. It is playing the 1 Nimble Marmot, which is, decent for just getting more cards into the graveyard, and it is playing the Monster Reborn as the legend card, whereas the second place deck is a lot more interesting. This is the Sea Serpent midrange. Now, we've recently seen Voltalon playing this quite a lot, and it's been doing quite well for him, but so far only 1 Sea Serpent midrange list has made it to the Area 1 battle's first or second place. But again, this looks very similar to the list that Volt was running. Very, very powerful deck with some very, very powerful kind of mid-rangey plays it can make, and it's good to see it represented over in Japan. So next up we have Bluetooth Gaia. So this is running the Bluetooth Dragon alongside the Gaia package, and once again it's a slimmed down Gaia package where it's only using Gaia the Fierce Knight and Veteran Curse of Dragon, completely foregoing the Veteran Gaia and the regular Curse of Dragon. We're also seeing Dark Lurker in here again, And we're seeing Cybertech Alligator as the legend of choice. Cybertech Alligator is an interesting one. I've seen a lot more people start to experiment with this card because it's good to just bring back a 1 tribute 2500 attack monster and pop a back row. 2500 is a very relevant number, and if you do draw into it, you can summon it quite easily with just a single tribute, rather than having to rely on something like a Blue Eyes White Dragon, which does require 2 tributes and can set you a little bit far behind on tempo. As for the second place deck, we have a Sea Serpent Maximum deck, and it is cracking. It's great again to see a Sea Serpent Maximum list here. Once again, it's on all Sea Serpents, and then the only 2 non-Sea Serpents are our Floodgates to try and stop our opponent from playing the game, as well as an interesting legend card in the Recurring Nightmare, which is specifically really good to get back our maximum pieces to hand. It's really cool to see Sea Serpent Maximum is still seeing a little bit of representation. For the final decks we have to look at, the first list is Pure Gaia, but this one is on the entire Gaia package, including the Vanilla Curse of Dragons and the Veteran Gaia the Fierce Knights. This looks more kind of tried and tested, more of the expected Gaia builds, but it does seem that this is not the type of build that is putting up a ton of results, but this is more of the kind of pure Gaia that we've been looking at. And then second place, once again, it is Seven's Wonder Fusion Turbo. And again, we are seeing a Legend normal monster in Archfiend Soldier to be used alongside Legend Strike, which seems to be in almost every single deck here. Looking down to the last 2 decks, we have Seven's Wonder Fusion and Seven's Wonder Fusion. Once again, we're seeing Dark Lurker in these builds, we're seeing a lot of the similar cards. It almost feels like the Seven's Wonder Fusion build has kind of almost been perfected at this point, and now it's just people having slight variations on what they already know work. Interesting here again, the Legend monsters are Riser and Pitch Black Werewolf, which are both fine choices. So if we take all of the first place lists and throw them into a pie chart, we get this. 4 Wonder, 2 Gaia, 1 Cyber Dragon, and 1 Gaia Bluetooth. From the 8 events we've seen so far, this is a pretty interesting spread. 50% of the winning deck lists are playing Seven's Wonder Fusion decks, which is expected. It is a very strong deck. It's always it's very easy to pilot. It's very easy to get good results with. You can kind of just steal a game out of nowhere, and people have to specifically play cards to stop you from doing what you're trying to do, or just hope you don't draw into your combo and just completely blow them out. So it's not surprising at all to really see this. I think one of the more surprising things is that Gaia is showing up so much. We have 2 pure Gaia lists and 1 Gaia Bluetooth list, which is very interesting. Gaia, it seemed, had potential to really pop off. I think a lot of people expected this to be kind of a low tier 2 deck, but this is starting to show that maybe it could even be a tier 1 deck. It's still a bit up in the air whether the Bluetooth or the pure variant is better, but from these results it does seem like the pure Gaia list is doing slightly better, but with only 8 results, it's still a little bit early to tell. Over the next few weeks, we'll be getting more and more results from the other regional events where we'll be able to look into that and add even more data and hopefully be able to draw some more concrete conclusions. I think the big standout here is Cyber Dragon. It's the only Cyber Dragon that we've seen in first or second place across any of these events. It'll be interesting to see if we see any in the upcoming events coming in the next few weeks. So if we add our second place deck lists to our pie chart, we get this. So now Seven's Wonder Fusion is 10 of the 16 deck lists. That is now over half. This deck is seeing such widespread use that it's getting a little bit ridiculous. I would not be surprised at all if we start to see Seven's Wonder hits on the upcoming ban list. What those could be is still a little bit up in the air, but I think people are starting to get behind Seven's Wonder Fusion down to 1 copy, maybe banning Seven's Gears, which is what I personally would love to see. The only other 2 decks that we added that weren't Wonder decks were Sea Serpent Midrange and Sea Serpent Kraken, which unfortunately managed to get up to second place, but neither of the Sea Serpent lists managed to break into a win. So if we go and take a look at the Legend Monster spread, so we're going to start off again with just the first place lists, and we're seeing Dark Magician is very popular. Now, this comes with a bit of a caveat because the only decks that are really playing Dark Magician are the Gaia decks, and that's because having Dark Magician on the field with its normal monster of 2900 defense does turn on the trap card, which does allow them to kind of make additional plays. Next, it gets a bit weird because we have Vorse Raider, just normal monsters to be used alongside Legend Strike. And these are primarily being used in the Seven's Wonder Fusion decks, again, just to get a pop, and it is nice to have an extra monster that you can normal summon and just use as tribute fodder, as well as it being a different type and attribute to try and use both the Seven's Mode Magician effect and the Seven's Gears effect to get an extra boost. Then we have Mirage Dragon, which again, this has always been quite a popular one. It's no surprise really that it's here. Being able to turn off battle traps is always really important. It stops Mirror Force, it stops Magic Cylinder, it stops Negate Attack, it stops quite a lot. Cybertech Alligator, again another normal monster. It really just goes to show how Legend Strike has really warped the meta, that most of the cards on here are Legend normal monsters. Now finally, just the one copy of Riser. Riser was extremely popular before the release of Legend Strike, but it seems like just getting that extra spell trap pop and an extra special summon from the graveyard is trumping the ability to deal with most threats using Riser's spin effect. And finally, one deck was on no Legend monster, which was interesting, but I guess if you feel like your deck doesn't need it, you don't need it. So if we add our second place deck lists to our pie chart, we can now see that Riser has taken his rightful place back in number 1 with 3 different decks using him. We also have Dark Magician, Vanity's Fiend, Jinzo, Archfiend Soldier, all now at 2 copies, and we've added Pitch Black Warwolf, which is basically Mirage Dragon. These cards are kind of interchangeable. But it's interesting to see, again, just how many of these cards are normal Legend monsters. We're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of the 16 Legend monsters, bear in mind one of them doesn't have any, so I suppose that's out of 15 Legend monsters, are normal monsters just to be brought back specifically with Legend Strike to pop a back row and just be used as the special summons. So it's very interesting how much Legend Strike has changed things up. Next up, if we look at the Legend spell cards. So again, if we look at just the first place list, bam, 5 of the 8 first place deck lists are playing Graceful Charity, a very, very powerful draw spell that helps you with a lot of consistency problems, helps you find the combo pieces you need, and can set up the graveyard, because a lot of decks in Rush do utilize the graveyard quite a lot. The other 3 we're seeing Power Bond. Obviously this is going to be unique to just the Light Machine Cyber Dragon deck. This won't be seen in pretty much any other deck. Heavy Storm, which again is a fantastic card, primarily being used by Seven's Wonder Fusion, again to try and just get their one combo off, deal with any back row your opponent might have to try and stop you, and then just blast them out the game. And then Monster Reborn, which typically is a very good mid-range tool, but I believe this Monster Reborn was in a Seven's Wonder Fusion deck again. So it's an interesting choice, but we'll have to see if that becomes more mainstay or if this is just kind of a one-off. But if we add in our second place decks, we get this, an extra 6 decks on Graceful Charity for a total of 11 out of 16 decks. That is an overwhelming majority. The other 2 cards that we've added is a Dark Hole and Recurring Nightmare. Again, Recurring Nightmare is very specific to the maximum deck to get back the maximum pieces to the hand. So next up, we'll take a look at our Legend traps. Now this is an interesting one. We have a 4-way tie between Mirror Force, Magic Cylinder, Torrential Tribute, and Negate Attack, all at 2 copies each. Now, interestingly enough, I did predict that Mirror Force was going to see a lot more play, but this seems to... It's seeing more play in the fact that it's now tied with Magic Cylinder, whereas before Magic Cylinder was the overwhelming majority, but we are not seeing Mirror Force, at least from these results, as being the overwhelming majority, which is what I was kind of expecting. Torrential Tribute is usually better in the side deck because you want to play it against the decks that specifically turn off your battle traps, things like Harpies, things like Sea Serpent Maximum, or against decks that can pop your back row, such as Gaia. So if you're expecting to play a lot of those decks, running Torrential Tribute in the main does seem like the right play, but otherwise I always prefer this card in the side deck. Negate Attack, again, is a very interesting card because in a lot of ways it is just worse than both Mirror Force and Magic Cylinder, but it does come with the Negator Dragon, which can, again, be a very, very powerful tool. If you can get the Negate Attack into the graveyard early and then use the Negator Dragon's effects to weaken your opponent's monsters, you can just over-aggro them or just kind of close out games very, very quickly. So if we add in our second place lists, we get this. And suddenly Mirror Force has the majority up at 6 decks. So it does seem that Mirror Force has been seeing a bit of an uptick, but Magic Cylinder is still hanging in there with 5. Torrential Tribute is now up to 3, and Negate Attack didn't gain any, so it's still down at 2. This is not too surprising, but it is interesting that the only 2 decks that brought Negate Attack did win, so we'll have to keep an eye on that one going forward. So the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the staples. So the staples that we specifically want to have a look at here is, first off, Barrier Statue. So Barrier Statue is a very, very annoying, very oppressive floodgate that can turn a lot of decks off. We started seeing people using Legend Strike to just keep it on the field and just keep turning your opponent's deck off as much as physically possible. And we've been seeing XQT Riding as a way to keep bringing it back as well, just to keep that floodgate going. So all 16 of the top decks here, from the top 2 lists from each of these 8 events, was playing Barrier Statue. So this card is everywhere. Next up, we want to look at Legend Strike. Again, a format warping card. This card has made people want to play more level 4s. It's making a lot of people use Legend normal monsters to get that effect off. It is just a very, very powerful tool. And of the 16 decks, 14 of them, so only 2 decks are not using Legend Strike at either 2 or 3 copies. The only 2 decks not using Legend Strike are both of our Sea Serpent decks, both the Kraken Maximum deck and the Sea Serpent midrange, which is very interesting. Presumably because those decks don't play a lot of level 4s and don't really want to make room for Legend Magician. Next up, Dark Lurker. 10 of the 16 decks are main decking Dark Lurker, with several more having it in the side deck. Again, it's a very, very powerful tool. Being able to destroy your opponent's back row is very, very good. It's a 7, so you can put it back in your hand and discard it with Ship of the 7 Treasures, and this card has been around forever. And after Konami released All-Seeing Harvey, that card felt like it was a deterrence to cards like Lurker, but despite Harvey being released, it seems like people are still fully gung-ho on the Lurker. Next up, Scat Thief. Nobody Scat Thief is a fantastic trap card. It's very good for consistency and it can stop you from losing the game in a lot of situations. This card is in 10 of the 16 decks. This is actually a little bit low. I was expecting to see this in a few more, to be honest, but I can understand that some decks just cannot find room for it. But again, Scat Thief, fantastic consistency card. And the last card I wanted to take a look at today was All-Seeing Harvey itself. 5 of the 16 decks are main decking the All-Seeing Harvey, which again can be good just to look at your opponent's back row, to make sure they haven't got anything that can stop you, or to specifically try and snipe something and try and make the odds more in your favor. But it's also really good for getting rid of those high defense monsters. Obviously, specifically in these events, it does seem like Lurker is the biggest offender, and it seems like All-Seeing Harvey is probably the best way to deal with that card. Future Matt here with just a little update. Obviously this video is out a little bit later than expected, and that does mean we did get some more results from more regional events over in Japan. We saw 2 Wonder Fusion decks win 2 more events, Reptiles taking a win, Monarchs getting a win, and Pure Glass Aggro also taking the top spot. For some more second place decks, we saw 2 more Wonder, 2 more Reptile, and interestingly, a Worm deck. So if we add all of this to our pie chart, just to make kind of one big all-encompassing winners and runners up deck lists, we get this, which is very interesting. And also big thanks to Voltalon for chucking all of these deck lists onto his spreadsheet ahead of them being released on yugioh.jp. Yeah, that is it. That is a look at all of the top 2 deck lists from each of the Area Number 1 battle held from the 9th to the 10th of September. Now again, every weekend we will be seeing more and more added, so the meta and the data that we have will continually grow. And as we go forward, we can see what other players over in Japan are including in their lists, and they're winning these large events with quite high attendance. So yeah, thanks for watching.